the ambition. I'm telling you, I've lived in the UK for 13 years. I left from 2005, came back, and I could sense the ambition all throughout Saudi Arabia, in all places. I mean, in every circles, that there isn't just a political identity, a foreign policy projection, but there's even something within Saudis now in Saudi society that I see myself. But how I see this taking place, and I think with the Abraham Accords and the Arab Peace Initiative, for example, or the Saudi position, Saudi will not join the Abraham Accords, and it will not be in its benefit to join the Abraham Accords, because it will then be seeming like following a trend set by the UAE, which is what I meant by the legacy.
Mm-hmm.
This is the legacy here. So now, as Saudi Arabia is growing and it's becoming a global player, not just in oil,
Mm-hmm.
it's becoming a tourist hub. It's becoming a place where people want to invest, and we still have some time to go, but it's going there urgently. Therefore, I think when it comes to Arab-Israeli relations, it will have a framework that speaks to its legacy, not following a legacy of the Abraham Accords.
This is the 966.
This is the 966, episode 70. Richard, hello.
70,
a
nice round number, really impressive round number. Happy New Year.
And Happy New Year to you as well. And we're starting off the new year really with an awesome first step here. We've got a great conversation coming up shortly with Dr. Aziz Alghashian, an expert on Saudi-Israel relations. Really fascinating discussion. Richard will be talking a little bit about water and some agriculture developments in Saudi Arabia and beyond. The Future Minerals Forum or Summit is coming up shortly, so we'll be talking about that as well. And we'll finish up, as we always do, with Yallah. Before we get going, we always remind our listeners and viewers to subscribe. Please smash that subscribe button for the 966 boys. We would really appreciate it.
Dude, yeah. I mean, our subscriptions are climbing steadily.
I think
Thanks
this works. Yeah, when we do this little thing at the beginning, I think it reminds enough people each time. It's really nice to see those numbers growing. So thanks for all of you who support us. That's awesome.
That's definitely the secret.
Richard, what's your one big thing this week? The first one big thing of 2023.
2023, one big thing kickoff. The 2023, the Future Minerals Forum, and we'll go with FMF because we'll be saying a lot. So the Future Minerals Forum will take place in Riyadh next week, January 10 through 12. And it will include a ministerial roundtable and followed by the forum and exhibition itself. This is the second Future Minerals Forum after last year's successful launch. Now, and it's expected to have 6,000 attendees from over 130 plus countries, 200 plus global industry speakers from 79 countries, 50 plus ministers and government officials, 150 plus mining companies, all the major ones. Lucian, one of the speakers will be our good friend Omar Khashoggi, an alumnus of the 966, and I'll be interested in getting his perspective as he spoke at last year's FMF as well. Quick background on mining. The mining activity in Saudi is racing along. 38 new mining licenses issued in November, up from 21 in October. The total mining exploration licenses in the kingdom now stand at 2,201, again, up from 2,164 just in October. In October, again, late October 2022, the Saudi Minister of Industry and Mineral Resources announced plans to auction 5 new mining exploration opportunities for local and international investors in 2023. These 5 new sites contain deposits of copper, zinc, lead, and iron, and are being auctioned, in line with new mining investment law. Again, as background, but I think this is an important summit, and it's becoming an important summit. And there's an interesting article published in International Mining Magazine with Rohitesh Dhawan, President and CEO of the International Council on Mining and Metals, the ICMM, a prominent association that deals with the industry. And he makes the purpose of the One Big Thing is really to share some of his interesting points that may not be apparent in this big shindig next week in Riyadh for the Future Minerals Forum. Point one, the Saudi FMF is a regional project. So he points out that in 2022, there were 32 ministers. And as I mentioned, in 2023, there will be over 50. And he says an interesting thing. The FMF itself is a valuable gathering to bring governments, mining operators, and others together to have high-level conversations. If you think about it, again, this is him speaking, the oil and the gas industry has OPEC and several other forums where it comes together. Mining has not really had that with significant ministerial and industry leadership level participation before. And for the MENA region, and to some extent the wider world, it is now performing that function, unquote. So that it being the Future Minerals Forum. So just in 2 years, it's sort of staked out a significant spot in the sector, both regionally and globally. Two, and this is interesting, MENA, Middle East, North Africa, represents about 23% of the global landmass and is geologically rich and diverse, yet it only accounts for about 6% of global mineral exploration spending. Its mineral reserves are already estimated over 1.6 trillion. This untapped potential is not just an attractive commercial proposition, but it provides a unique opportunity to make giant leaps in sustainable and responsible mining practices. Again, this is the CEO of the ICMM speaking. And it is interesting, Lucian, when we see a lot of reporting on the new mining law, but also on the bids and that sort of thing, that there's a significant discussion about sustainability. Three, and again, the CEO speaking, I have been really encouraged and impressed by the level of detail that both the Saudi minister and vice minister of industry and mineral resources have spoken about on certain key issues. These include water, relocation of local communities, tailings, and sustainability standards. Also on how to measure social and economic benefits. So interesting article that give a little bit of a bigger picture than just there's a bunch of key people meeting in Riyadh next week to talk about Saudi, geological and mineral prospects and opportunities. We track this. The new mining law came into effect, new Saudi mining law came into effect in January 2021. And in putting that together, they drew from expertise in Canada, Australia, Botswana, and Africa, as well as the World Bank. And they seem to be very committed to employing best practices in all phases of the sector. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make is, they're trying to do it right. They're trying to obviously develop their own domestic industry, but also become a nexus for the MENA region. And this Future Mineral Forums, I think, is the flagship for that larger effort. So it's an increasingly interesting confab. And as I mentioned, I'll be really interested to hear what Omar Khashoggi thinks about it this year.
Yeah, Richard, that's a really good one. Omar Khashoggi was a guest really early on when we were launching this podcast. One of the first maybe 10 episodes. I'll have to go back, but he was fantastic. Worth going back to listen to that conversation. His family and his fund is interested in gypsum, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's one of his businesses. Yeah,
mm-hmm. Yeah.
Omar is a Renaissance man. He's into everything. He also physically handicapped and special needs kids. He does things with next generation. He's amazing. He's one of the more interesting people in Saudi Arabia, and
real estate as well. I mean, yeah. And Richard, that was a really good One Big Thing, because this is huge. And two points really to make that I would like to get your thoughts on. Actually, one thing that I saw was interesting about this forum is it's being sort of billed not just for the Middle East, but a term that I haven't seen much, the wider Middle East, or the extended Middle East, that includes parts of Western Asia and a lot of Africa, is sort of a larger sort of footprint that they're talking about here. And Saudi Arabia really has made themselves, and this forum, the FMF, is that the FMF? Yeah. Right. As sort of the annual, I mean, this event has really, really grown. And you could sort of see it this year with a lot of the press coming out beforehand in the months leading up to it. So this is good. This is a big deal, and it's a big thing because it's a big show that they're putting on in just 5 days here. The other thing that I would like to note, Richard, is that I think it's interesting about this is the Ministry of Industry and Mineral Resources has really two hats. It's industry and mineral resources. So you have Bander Al-Kraif, Osama Zamel, Khalid Al-Mudaifer. These guys are sort of leading the ministry, which really has two mandates. And, all mining is really part of industry and industrial development, really, but not all industrial development is part of mining. So the focus here on mining really indicates how serious they're taking mining as a way to diversify the economy. It's not just, oh, well, we need to create jobs as an abstract thing. It's we are investing heavily in, and this year, Richard, was a great year for them because they had an auction for the Hanagia. There it is. I used it. Mining site. I was waiting to drop it in. The Hanagia mining site, they had a successful auction for it. And you mentioned they're going to auction off 5 other sites as well. It's clear that there's a lot of activity going on here. So then to host sort of the larger industry-wide event for the region, the wider region, as they're saying now, is significant for Saudi Arabia. And you're seeing something sort of similar in tourism, right? Because tourism is really soaring in Saudi Arabia, and there's a lot of sort of untapped potential there. And so Saudi Arabia, just recently hosted the World Tourism Summit or Forum Council, which was a huge deal. So really part of Saudi Arabia's emerging power story here.
Well, this is agreed. And the government officials you name, it may be good PR, maybe anything, but they all seem to be surpassingly capable and competent.
Yes.
And we've talked again from the very beginning of the 966 about this mining sector and how for years and years, they want it to be the third leg, the third pillar after oil and petrochemicals. And it's rapidly becoming that. We've also talked in the 966 how 2023, this coming year, is going to be sort of, it's shaping up to be a year where a lot of this stuff starts coming together. And it's funny, one of our Yallahs will be on Hyundai and coming in from manufacturer. You can see their automotive sector, a sector they've just worked so hard and wished so hard to develop, starting to come together. Minerals, tourism, aviation, all these things that they've been planning, talking about, making announcements. Hopefully you start seeing really significant traction on the ground. And the mining, again, as we've talked about, I think in 2021, the mining industry made $23 billion. So it was already pumping along. But it's muscling up even further. And as this, the CEO of ICMM talks about, it's a regional thing now. And it looks like Saudi Arabia is trying to position itself as the nexus for the region.
Yeah, it's not like a nascent. It's a good point. It's not like a nascent industry. And
not the mining.
Been around. Yeah, mining. Yeah, it's been around for forever, but it's sort of untapped and not fully realized. So that's a good point. The last sort of point I want to make here is the tie-in to, and you alluded to it, Richard. Actually, well, you said it, but the tie-in to the green economy and sustainability here is sort of at the front. It's not just an afterthought. And then you see Saudi Arabia being interested in EVs and battery manufacturing is a complex process. So you have sort of that tie-in with the both, hats or pillars of what the ministry is doing. It's just, there's really a lot here that it'll be interesting to watch.
But we can't really leave this topic and without getting in your other favorite geological term. And you've got Hanagia in, but your other one, as I recall, is Arabian Shield.
The Arabian Shield, yes, which is so cool. I don't know why that's so cool, but I feel like it would have a really good logo, and maybe a superhero tied to it.
Yeah, we could get an action figure out of that for sure.
I'm sure we could. Yeah. The Arabian Shield is a significant. Richard, this was one of the first big things we did. Man, we're really going back into the Wayback Machine, but I think it was last January or February when we started talking about Hanagia for the first time. When I was first able to successfully pronounce something correctly on the first time. This is a really good one, Richard. This will be interesting to see. There'll be a lot of media coming out of it this week, as there was in advance of it. So there'll be a lot coming out. We'll have to check in with Omar as well. Who will be speaking. So very good. Richard, my one big thing is water.
Yes.
which is the most abundant resource on the planet. It is everywhere. There's a lot of talk about water these days in Saudi Arabia. Of course, first, we'll be talking about what everyone talks about all the time, the weather. There's lots of rain coming down across Saudi Arabia right now, actually. A few reports of some flash flooding in Jeddah earlier this week and some last week. We have videos showing rain in Mecca, elsewhere in the kingdom. Steady stream of rain in Riyadh. It's, according to my weather app, drizzling there right now.
Well, and kids are out of school.
Just about to say schools have moved to online learning. No, please. It's a good, your timing was perfect. Students have moved to online learning across Saudi Arabia to put safety first for parents, which is interesting. In the US, just, interrupting myself, snow usually cancels school here. But the further north you go, the more open schools tend to be when it snows because they're used to it. Just the same phenomenon in Saudi Arabia with rain. There isn't a lot. So when it comes down, flooding is a serious risk. So safety first. Segueing into the water sector in Saudi Arabia, there's been a lot of investment and transition in the water sector. This is necessary given Saudi Arabia's growing population, major investments in tourism, new developments in and around existing cities like Riyadh, and new mega cities. Richard, you almost certainly remember. If you don't, that's okay. I wrote a piece for Sustig back in 2013, 10 years ago now, which absolutely blows my mind. I actually went back to read it. I found it was actually cited as a source on a book about water in Saudi Arabia called Arab Water Security, Threats and Opportunities in the Gulf States. I was so stoked to see that. I screenshotted it and sent it around like I'm some sort of genius, which I am not. The piece that I wrote, and we sort of worked on it together, was highlighting the kingdom's water challenges and how they really needed a national plan for consumption, production, conservation, and it was in the works. As you remembered, Richard, back then they were sort of phasing out wheat production and just making huge changes to agriculture because they were drawing down on aquifers too quickly. And of course, drawing down on aquifers too quickly with not a lot of rain coming in, is not great. I will get back to this in 1 minute, but first, 2 reports out this week. One, a new report out from the Saline Water Conversion Corporation, SWCC. It's a sort of quasi-government or maybe even totally government-owned corporation. They call it a position paper addressing water security in arid and water-stressed regions. We will include that paper in the show notes on both Apple, iTunes podcasts, and also for our YouTube users. It's worth a look. Not terribly detailed, but very interesting. The second paper, released ahead of the World Future Energy Summit, highlights the significant private sector prospects in the kingdom's water sector. The paper underlines Saudi Arabia's potential to spur private sector growth in the water sector as the country deals with the rising water demand brought on by economic diversification, population expansion, and urbanization. By 2027, the kingdom's desalination capacity, which is essentially taking seawater, removing the salt, which is a energy intensive and very complex procedure, is anticipated to more than double from its current level of little more than 3 million cubic meters per day to 7.5 million cubic meters per day by 2027. Interesting too on sewage treatment facilities, 147 of them spread out over the nation. The Saudi government is also spending money on nearly 15,000 kilometers of wastewater collection networks. So I think just kind of stepping back, a little bit of a big picture here, we're sort of in a water transition for Saudi Arabia, which was ongoing before Vision 2030, but just like everything else, sort of accelerated everything that has happened. And we're on the more mature side of what they're doing there, and starting to get some recognition for it. And that has led Saudi Arabia to explore farming and agriculture opportunities abroad, mainly for wheat, but for import from places like Ukraine and in Africa, but not just wheat, alfalfa, other things that they're essentially growing abroad and importing into Saudi Arabia. They have been doing that a lot through the company Almarai, which is the largest agriculture company in Saudi Arabia. And recently, Almarai has been at the receiving end of some bad press in the United States. The kingdom's largest agricultural, tough word to say, company, has a subsidiary in Arizona called Fondomonte. Fondomonte. I think. See, look, I mess up pronunciations in any language, so it's not
nailed,
an Arab
you
thing.
nailed
Yeah.
the Arabic term. Yeah, they just named it in Arabic.
Everything's just kind of I'll just put that in there. They've come under fire. There was a New York Times report and then a local sort of report blasting Fondomonte really for its use of groundwater in Arizona, where it's very similar to Saudi Arabia in terms of climate. Not a lot of rain. Everybody's draining the aquifer and the groundwater. So I dug into this a little bit because it sort of seems like an interesting story. Saudi Arabia farming in a very similar climate to its home climate and then importing back into Saudi Arabia. I saw, Richard, I don't know if I shared this with you or maybe you already saw it, but there's an interview in a local website of Arizona called High Country News with a geographer named Natalie Koch, a professor at Syracuse University who grew up in Arizona, studies the Arabian Peninsula actually. And she had some interesting context and thoughts on this issue, it's the classic issue where, Americans are upset that Saudis are stealing US water and then growing crops and sending them away. Kind of easy to get upset about. But what she said was part of what people are so upset about, especially people in Arizona, is that the farm is producing alfalfa, a hugely water intensive crop. But Arizona has cultivated alfalfa for a long time because in the desert, you can get multiple harvests in a given year as long as you have enough water. Then she goes on to talk about some of the historical context, which is cool. Al-Marai, as we know, is headquartered in Riyadh. The farming industry has really been important in the kingdom since 1930. When 1930s, when King Ibn Saud wanted to development, the U.S. government sponsored a team of Arizona farmers to go over in 1942 to share their experience of growing alfalfa and all the water extraction techniques they had mastered in Arizona. Then it circled back, she said. King Saud and his family made a royal visit to Arizona. They did this whole tour of Arizona, agriculture, and looked at the Arizona dairy industry as well. King Saud went back to Saudi Arabia, pushed to set up a dairy industry there. What we see now is the legacy of that, but it's not only the connection, but that's not the only connection between Arizona and the Arabian Peninsula. She goes on to really highlight all the sort of random Saudi U.S. connections in agriculture and water development in their arid spaces. So really interesting. I'm going to actually include a link to that as well. It's a longer interview and there's a lot of context in there. So water is my one big thing right now in Saudi Arabia, from the weather to the all the work going on by the government and now the investment opportunities in the private sector they're pushing. And then, this issue that was raised in Arizona, highlighting sort of what Saudi Arabia is doing from an agriculture standpoint. Very interesting stuff.
It is, and that was an article in the New York Times, so it may be paywalled. So, but it was excellent. And this was, I think, at the beginning of December. End of December.
Yep.
And it should be noted that the article pretty much talks about Fondomonte's activities and so on, but it does not lay the blame at the foot of the Saudis. She talks a lot about Arizona, long-standing Arizona water laws, and people can get you can as deep as you can drill a hole. If you can get water, it's yours.
Precisely. Yep.
And it's it is indeed, it is sort of still the Wild West, and so the Saudis are sort of a minor player among a lot of people who are trying to take advantage of sort of the very lax water restrictions in Arizona, which is it's counterintuitive given the shortage of water, but that's the way it is in the West and in many places. So it was an interesting story. I thought it was actually, despite the headline, there's always clickbait. The headline: Arizona's race to the bottom of water wells with Saudi Arabia's help. If you read the article, it is good because it talks about Al-Marai and Fondomonte, but it doesn't it talks about the systemic issue that's caused by Arizona, regulatory requirements or lack thereof. But anyway, water. Your piece. You're a celebrated author, which is good.
I'm a cited author in the field of water in Saudi Arabia.
It's extraordinary.
Which I just found out 7 years later.
It's extraordinary, when you talk about their drive to more than double their cubic, million cubic meters of daily output salinated water, desalinated water. And I think, and we also talk about waste management. It's funny how all these tie up. I mean, there's a reason Jeddah went through a horrible period, and people lost their jobs. Companies were banished or fined, where they simply could not handle water runoff. Flash floods, or municipal works, or sewerage. It's just a real problem. And I think a lot of what this is happening, and it's important. It's probably later than it should have been, is quality of life issues are coming into play. Waste management, water management. When you're looking at Riyadh and Jeddah in particular, part of the commitment that the government is making to its people is that quality of life is going to improve, which means you're not going to have a flash flood anytime there's a spring rain. You're not going to have garbage in the streets. You're not going to have wastewater runoff. And interesting, again, this is a big stretch in the coral area. They've significantly stiffened their sort of pollution laws. In other words, your littering laws. Reminds me a little bit. Remember the Keep America Beautiful campaign way back when we were kids? I looked into that a little bit. That actually started in the 1950s, but we only know it because we remember that Indian who was not an Indian with the tear coming
crying.
Outside. Yeah. And as it turns out, he was not Indian. It was all, but typical US, it was, a marketing thing. But it brought to the fore an awareness of it. Increasingly, you're seeing that in Saudi Arabia. Take pride in your country. Don't litter. It's a quality of life issue. Anyway, that's kind of a bit of a digression from what you're talking about. But it all sort of ties together, and they're all sort of trying to head to the same spot, which is an improved quality of life in every aspect.
It's funny, Richard. I don't think that there is a single article or piece on Saudi Arabia that comes out on a holiday or at any point in the year that you don't see and know about and have read totally, because you nailed it with the New York Times piece. It came out right around Christmas. So right. I remember seeing the headline and being like, oh, here we go. And then reading the article later being like, oh, so the U.S. military is the biggest offender over there. Right. There are other major big ags just going into the ground. The problem is no regulation. Just kudos to you, because as soon as I saw you start responding, I was like, he's read this. Yep.
You're the cited, expert on
that's true. Yes.
So clearly, I'm just hanging on to your coattails.
Well, real recognizes real here. I can't even say that with a straight face. But it's interesting too. I remember flash floods were sort of an issue, and they've been an issue in Riyadh too, but they're an issue in San Francisco right now. They're getting these atmospheric rains that are dumping an unusual amount of rain, or a sort of, it's an anomaly. Even if it's an annual anomaly or whatever, it's flash floods happen all over the world, and Saudi Arabia, you're right, with the Jeddah story, there was even sort of anti-corruption investigations and stuff to sort of clean that up. But really interesting. And yeah, I think that once you get past the headline on that story, you're like, oh, so Al Marai and Saudi Arabia is just the convenient whipping boy, as it always is in a story that really isn't about them at all. Yeah.
Put Saudi in the headline, you'll get some views.
Yep, exactly. And that's one of the things that we do with our newsletter, Richard, every day for 15 years now, is get beyond the headlines and really digest every single news article that comes out, not just news articles, position papers and academic studies, and digest and sort of organize them for our readers. So it's just a great resource.
This article, we were back at it December 28th. So this article would have been the December 28th issue of the Sister Review. Subscribe if you don't already.
Yep, do it, because it's so good. And we get people talking about it all the time. Just like we get people talking about this podcast all the time, which we're excited as a natural offshoot.
Well, now they're going to be coming to hear Fondamonte.
Yes. Richard, what's the next step for us? Are we going to get set up in the metaverse, or maybe we...
I got to tell you, my avatar will have to look better than I do. That's you have no hope for an upgrade, because your avatar can be only so striking and dashing. But my avatar, oh, the things I could do.
That was a cool trend that was happening about 2 weeks ago. Everybody's just uploading very sort of stylized, cartoonish pictures of themselves, and then it's kind of totally stopped. But yeah, maybe we will open this up in the metaverse. We'll have an in-person studio. We'll be broadcasting in all directions. I don't even know how the metaverse works, to be honest. I'm just talking. It's a podcast.
Well, also maybe we can actually follow through, because we've been talking about 966 merch here, and I have done nothing. Maybe we can get maybe it's all just digital. We can gin up some 966 merch on the metaverse.
Yeah. Well, I think we start with 966 tattoos. We'll get a tattoo parlor set up, get a nice tattoo artist to do the Kingdom Tower with the headphones on it, our logo. So we are way off the topic of water now, and that is my fault. I think we bring it right back. Richard, let's get to our really awesome conversation with Dr. Aziz Alghashian, Saudi researcher, writer, on Saudi Israel stuff. He's awesome. You guys are going to enjoy this.
He deserves a better lead in.
He deserves a better lead in, but the cowboy fan thing, I mean, he kind of loses a couple points on that. So
I love this discussion. He is a true scholar on the subject, and it's an important subject, and he provides real insight and clarity on how to maybe, organize it in your brain. Mm-hmm. But really a good conversation.
Enjoy. We are speaking now with Dr. Aziz Alghashian, a Saudi researcher and writer who is, according to one bio we've seen online, a researcher who is fascinated with the elusivity of Saudi foreign policy. Dr. Aziz holds a PhD from the University of Essex in 2019, where he taught international relations, politics, and Middle Eastern studies. He's focused a little bit on Saudi-Israeli relationships budding here recently. So we're very excited to talk to you, Dr. Aziz. Welcome to the 966.
Thank you so much, and it's a pleasure to be with you both. Thank you very much.
We're excited about sort of getting a better grasp of your scholarship on the Abraham Accords and the Saudi and the Gulf perspective on these accords. But there's an elephant in the room, which is that Cowboys sign. And
yes. Listen, when you talk Saudi diplomacy, it's very hard to avoid the Cowboys, I would say, given the legacy of Prince Bandar bin Sultan. So it's a really interesting story. So I was actually brought up in the States, which I shared with you guys in Virginia. So my father worked in the Saudi embassy there, and then I remember my earliest memories. I was actually a Washington Redskins fan.
Yes.
But you're not old enough to actually have been here when they were great.
Yeah. You're like me.
No, definitely. I think when it was when they won 52-17, that's against the Bills.
Yeah, the last.
Yeah. Right. And that's when I was like, I think I better focus on them. And then and then so my brother, because he was good friends with Prince Bandar's son Faisal bin Bandar, who's I think working on the esports, I think, or something. He's a good guy. He's a real good guy. And so they were friends. And then of course, so I think I was socially conditioned to like the Cowboys, and it kind of spilled over from that legacy of Prince Bandar into this house. So that's how
I'd like to say we're all now Commanders fans here, but
of course,
so bad for so long that is not the case. As you said, you said you were out in the area recently, and when you picked up that Cowboys sign, and it was the second bestseller.
It was the second bestseller. And that was because I wanted to ask. I was like, listen, what how because I went there, I bought a hat too. There was another place, and then some guy was like, yo man, what you doing, man? What do you do? And he was giving me all this kind of crap, and I was like, and then I forgot that I'm in Washington territory here, right, and buying this. And then I kind of remember that banter. And then so when I asked the guy, I'm like, do they buy it to burn this or something, or do they buy it to, what's going on here? And then they're like, listen, it's the bestseller. It's the bestseller here. And the Eagles were pretty good, pretty high up there. Giants were pretty high up.
You also, we're lucky to have you. You're joining us from Riyadh. You were talking about, you said it's been raining. You have a family farm just outside of Riyadh.
Yes. So I was actually there. I was New Year's, I wanted to go there. I finished a couple of things kind of last week. And then, so we went to a place called Druma. Drumma, Saudi Arabia, and it was on the it's past the Qiddiya where the Six
Right.
Flags is going to be, and me and my nephew, we knew it was going to be rainy, and so we decided, we were like, listen, let's just go to the farm and make the most out of this beautiful weather that's going to happen. Sometimes they say it's going to rain and then it doesn't rain, but then we were like, listen, let's just make the most out of this. And it's been raining nonstop for the past few days. I think today was the easiest day that you know eased up a little bit. So I mean, you guys were very close to seeing a very scruffy, very cold, unshaved, messy hair disease on the 966. But then I said, I don't want to make my first appearance on the 966 like this. So it's been there, and the farm is it's been in the family for ages, and so we raise. So my brother raises camels there. My other brother has he's a horse fan, so he has a lot of horses there, or a few horses. But the interesting about my brother, who was in AU, I think in the early 2000s, left AU, came back to Saudi, and then became I would say one of the top people in Saudi that know about camels. He's so passionate about it. And there was a period of time where we actually had ostriches in the farm.
Sweet.
And they really had a weird sound. That it was very interesting, and it was a very colorful time at the farm when they were there.
Is it a good egg? I hear ostrich eggs are okay.
It's
like
massive.
Really big. Yeah.
I thought I was walking into a dinosaur museum or something. It was like a big thing, and yeah. So we used to collect it, and then I don't know what happened, but you know, the Saudi sun is very. It's ruthless. It's ruthless.
Yeah.
It takes its toll on things.
So tell us. So you grew up here, you know, in Northern Virginia, but all your MA, your MA, your BA, and your doctorate are all in the UK.
Yeah.
You also spent it. You were at Sandhurst, which is a famous military academy.
Yeah.
Well, were you a troublemaker as a kid? They sent you.
Was I, or still am? I don't know. That's the question. No, I was brought up in the US, and then I think actually what's really interesting was that the plan was always to go back to the US and study there for my BA and MA, and I've always wanted to study international relations. So I went. I was planning on going there, but unfortunately, it was just after about 9/11. I think remnants of, Islamophobia and just people were very worried. So I think it wasn't an option. So we looked elsewhere, and then the first thing that came up actually was Sandhurst, and I was like, I heard about this place, I'm not really sure. Then I realized you had to really run a lot. So I was like, all right. Then I was like, well, I guess I'm going to have to do that for a while. So yeah, it was actually, I'm really, blessings come in disguises sometimes. And while I really wanted to go back and of course live in the States and experience, the university in the United States in DC, where I feel home, to be honest with you, because I went there, I was brought up there. But I went to the UK, and I got a very interesting experience there. Grew up and developed in, of course, Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst. I was there actually at a very interesting time. So Prince Harry and Prince William were there at the same time. So I remember even playing football, and they were playing football there as well. Especially, yeah, and they, those people, they shouted at everyone equally, and they really shouted.
They were all part of it.
Yeah, they were all part of it. They all shouted at everyone equally. It was a very interesting time to be there. And then I commenced my BA and MA and PhD, and then lectured. So I stayed. The majority of my life was actually in the UK. Hence the British accent that I have now.
So so let's talk about your scholarship, which we find very interesting. And we first got together because you wrote a really interesting article um, back in April 2021 for the Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. And as everybody knows who listen to 966, we're big fans of Arab Gulf States. They do really good scholarship and have a lot of really intelligent, thoughtful people there. But the article was entitled "Misleading Elements in Current Gulf Israeli Discourse," and it spoke, it was directly addressed the Abraham Accords, and so it was an excellent article. We recommend it, and so we wanted to get Dr. Aziz on to talk about this because I think the Abraham Accords are fascinating to me. They remind me of that old parable about 6 blind men and an elephant, where one's touching the hide and it said this is a wall, one's touching the tail and this is a snake, one touches the trunk and the tail, it's a rope, and the trunk is a snake. Anyway, you have all these different judgments and determinations of what it is we're looking at. And I think you get to that very, very accurately and effectively in your piece. Before we do that, I feel like we should give a little context of the Abraham Accords for our listeners, just so we have a good starting point. And I'll throw it out there, and you interject here and correct me and add and edit as needed. But I think by any measure, these are significant agreements, and these were first ones with Israel and the UAE and Bahrain, Israel and Bahrain in September 2020. Later in December 2020, Morocco joined the accord. In January 2021, Sudan joined the accord. And essentially, it's important because these are the first diplomatic relationships established with Arab states by Israel since 1994, and that was with Jordan. So you have, a 30-year interlude essentially there. So it's a big step. And I think we have to recognize that there's been some real benefits, especially economically. I think in the UAE, there's been a record 1.4 billion in trade with Israel in the first 7 months of 2022. A significant uptick in Israeli tourism, 450,000 Israeli tourists. Again, this was by the middle of the year last year. Morocco, again, bilateral relationships greatly expanded. They hope to reach $250 million in trade next year. Again, huge uptick, fourfold uptick in Israeli tourism. Bahrain and Israel signed over 40 MOUs, largest defense agreement with, significant multilateral implications. Sudan, less active. And we'd have to recognize that both Sudan and Morocco, I think that their entrance into the Abraham Accords was a little more political in nature, maybe a little less organic than the UAE and Israel.
It's true.
But then I had
with the Sudan one, sorry to interrupt here, but with the Sudan one, it's actually still not ratified because it's waiting for the democratic elected government or the parliament so it's under this it's still under the military kind of regime right now. It's this transitional council. And so in order for it to be adopted and agreed, the parliament has to ratify it, which there wasn't one being ratified already because they're not functioning. So
interesting.
So that's the thing about the Abraham Accords with Sudan, that officially they haven't yet normalized. And I think with Morocco, it didn't start off as a normalization. It started off as a kind of an elevation of relations at first. And then then I think a year after, which is, not long ago, the relations were elevated to a normalization of relations, of diplomatic recognition, etc.
So this is why I'm really looking forward to the conversation and why I think it's valuable, because you're very meticulous about being accurate.
Yeah.
And it's important. Yeah. And just one closing thought on sort of the scene setter. There was a Negev Forum summit in March of this year, which is significant. You had 6 foreign ministers from, 4 Arab states Bahrain, Egypt, Morocco, and the UAE, as well as Israel and the U.S. Secretary of State meeting in Israel. So there's ongoing conversation. This wouldn't have happened previously. So it's significant. So you can look at the Abraham Accords, established in late 2020 and say, okay, this is promising. There's something here. What I'd like to do, and one of the really excellent things about your piece, and you very specifically state, that there cannot be an accurate understanding of any relationship without an accurate discourse surrounding it.
Yes.
And you state that in the discourse on the agreement between Gulf Arab states and Israel, and I think for our purposes we'll probably focus mostly on UAE and Bahrain and Israel. In the discourse on the agreements between the Gulf Arab states and Israel, 3 particular notions have been oversimplified or exaggerated. 1, you mentioned alliances. 2, the Gulf, in quotes, yes, as a monolith.
I'll make sure I put that. Yeah.
Yeah, you will have with everybody all at once now. and 3, the centrality of Iran.
Yeah.
So let me start with you on this, Dr. Aziz. What is normalization? How is it misunderstood? But walk us through what you say, what you point out as 3 major points of where there's not accuracy on the discourse.
Yeah. So I think to build upon, firstly, your introduction and your preface was very much accurate, and I'd like to use it to build upon also the relations between some GCC states and Israel. So there were relations before, official relations with them historically. So it was Oman and Qatar that developed relations with Israel in the mid-90s. And this actually came against the backdrop of the Oslo Accords, and also kind of this notion of there is a push for peace. And I think if people look at, even Prince Bandar bin Sultan's book, The Prince, and others, there's always this idea of, all right, here's an effort that's gonna, hopefully we could make a push for peace. So they had business relations with Israel, and then it was around 2002 it was kind of then seized. Official relations. The unofficial is something completely different. But then so that was the first relation. So there was a precedent of respective GCC states and Qatar, and so Qatar and Oman with Israel.
Well, can I interrupt just briefly?
Sure.
Is there any significant about 2002? That was the Arab peace plan, the King Abdullah peace plan,
yes,
correct?
Yes.
It was that some sort of, why did those relationships, the Qataris and the Omanis, why did that?
Yeah, well, it because it was after the Intifada, and it was during the Intifada, which is, by the way, the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative was an extension of the Intifada. Mm-hmm. It was a result of the Intifada. It was a way of saying, okay, here's a framework to deal with this Intifada, and that was the calculation. So it didn't just come out of nowhere, and of course it was, also carrying on from the Camp David Accords and the failure of the Camp David Accords, or the Camp David effort, I think, in Yehud Barak and Arafat and Clinton, etc. And then that led to the Intifada of 2000, the end of 2000. Mm-hmm. What postponed the 2002 Arab Peace Initiative, which was based on the Saudi Peace Initiative, which was a month prior, and what postponed it was 9/11, was the September 11 attacks. It was a response. It was a response to the Intifada immediately, but then once the 9/11 happened, and then obviously the world changed, and the United States was not in any kind of mentality to receive any kind of peace talks at that moment. So that was postponed. So that's why people are sometimes think it's an isolated incident, when actually it's an extension of it. And that's a legacy in its own, by the way. And that's why recently Netanyahu, when he said, we have to move on from the Arab Peace Initiative, because it has a legacy of addressing the Palestinian issue, when the Abraham Accords is now another legacy of something else that I will get into. And I think there's competing legacies here between the Abraham Accords and the Arab Peace Initiative. But I think with the Abraham Accords, it is indeed a milestone, as you say, or as you very much. This is not a small thing that just took place. This changed the political landscape of the Arab-Israeli relations. And I think for me, I always use the term Arab-Israeli relations a lot more than I would with Arab-Israeli conflict, because I think historically, I've always researched the commonalities that Saudi Arabia and Israel had, and Arab states and Israel had, even days before they were even recognizing each other. Days before they were recognized as states. I mean, this goes back to early 20th century communication, cooperation, very implicit form. So for me, Arab-Israeli relations is something so interesting and so worth looking into, because it actually builds new concepts of how people consider and conceptualize relations. It expands vocabulary, really, of how people talk about how interstate relations take place. And that's why I said there has to be a new discourse, or a befitting discourse. And one of the misleading elements was this notion of alliances and alliances. For me, I think in my PhD, because my PhD was precisely on the Saudi foreign policy towards Israel, and that's the book project that I'm currently working on now. It's one of the things. One of the things that I argue is that I say, listen, okay, alliances. Sometimes it's been considered as a Saudi-Israeli alliance, that there is an underground alliance, and that's just complete and utter. That's just flawed, because alliances in nature are obligatory contractual forms of cooperation. They're very obligatory. They're very contractual. They're overt, and they're meant to be overt. And therefore, so this then begs the question, why do people use alliances then? And in my opinion, I think one of the things that they use it is as a political weapon, as a political instrument to demonize. Either you see the anti-Saudi bloc in the region always equivocating or always correlating Saudi Arabia with Israel, with the Zionists. They're the allies of the Zionists. They're the allies of Israel. Look at how bad they are. Look at this. Look at that. They're the allies. It's a strong projection. It's a strong description of relations in order to demonize. And at the same time, you get on the other side you have people within Israel that politicize it and say, well, we're allies already, aren't we? And this is what Netanyahu said I think in a 60-minute interview, 2016. He's like, the alliance is already there. And of course, what is he doing? He's politicizing this relationship. But actually, there isn't a Saudi-US alliance. And this is one of the things that I talk about in the piece. And there isn't even an Israeli-American alliance in that form.
In the truest form of the term.
In the truest form of the term, you're right. In the essence of it, there's a political obligation. And why do people use it interchangeably is because sometimes in alliances, and thank you for emphasizing this notion, but sometimes in alliances like NATO, allies don't tend to work very well sometimes. So in some instances where there is no official, the truest form of relations, sometimes they work very, very well. So but it's important to discuss that. And just to illustrate what kind of descriptions and categories are we using?
When we're using the term alliance, I want to ask really quickly, are we talking about like a firm U.S. treaty, like Congress would pass a treaty? Is that sort of right? And then everything else is sort of loosely, Saudi Arabia, Israel, but we only have a firm alliance with, like you said, NATO, things that went through Congress. Is that sort of correct?
Well, I think it for me, I consider it in the military sense, and the fact that there is an obligation to react whenever there is a country that is under threat. All for one and one for all, that kind of notion. And in that kind of notion, there isn't one. This is something Martin Indyk said, the former American ambassador to Israel.
Yeah.
And so, and I even in that piece, I actually put a reference to all the alliances that were studied. I think I forgot by who. There was a study about all the alliances that were taking place. So this term alliances, it is an exaggerated form, but sometimes we don't know that we're using it, and a lot of statesmen use it, but that's, I think it's important just to emphasize on this kind of.
And you make a very good point about different sides claiming their interpretation of what an alliance is, but that the opening of that, to me, it seems, is that what is normalization? I mean, I don't know what normalization is. I've read the Abraham Accords and the verbiage. And it is really interesting when you go through the Abraham Accords. We'll get to this point, your point later. There's nothing about Iran, but what is normalization? And it sounds as if when you read the document, well, this is sort of a normalization of diplomatic relations. But you're exactly right. It's not a contractual agreement. It's not you're not signatory to it's not an Article 3 of NATO.
Exactly.
So, what is normalization? And because it leaves it wide open, because you have, I mean, it's fascinating to me that, you referenced Netanyahu, who has just been reelected as prime minister, and, one of the most right-wing, aggressive, governments in the history of Israel, immediately talking about normalization, relationships with Saudi Arabia. I mean, it's clearly politicized, as you say.
No, it is. You're very much spot on there when it comes to, well, what is normalization? And somehow normalization seems to be also very much misunderstood. And I think, one of the aspects that, or one of the times that made me realize how just bad people understand normalization, or how the general media discourse, Western-centric discourse, I would say, misunderstand sometimes normalization, was during the Biden visit to Saudi Arabia in July. So when he was visiting Jeddah, maybe you guys recall, I'm sure you guys recall, there was this idea that, well, okay, we might not get normalization, but what about getting an air defense alliance? And for me, that sounded like, and I remember telling someone, that sounded like saying, you know what, I'm Aziz, I'm on a diet here. I'm not going to have that small piece of candy, but I will have that massive chocolate cake all to myself. With this idea, it's a misunderstanding, as if it's like, no, an air defense alliance is okay, but not normalization. And it's actually the people that are normalized their relations together. And by the way, normalization it is always has different meanings with different partners and different protagonists, the people that are involved.
Clearly. Yeah.
The meaning of normalization and what is to be normalized and what is not to be normalized is something very different. So, for example, when they are talking about Saudi Arabia and Turkey normalization of relations, they're not saying an absence of diplomatic ties. They're talking about an elevation of ties, an improvement of ties. Okay, that normalization is clearly different than the Saudi-Israeli potential normalization, for example.
Right.
So here, normalization is always, it's very much fluid according to really what the context and the partners and the participants are regarding this. And to be honest, I mean, that's why many people, I think, I won't blame many people for misunderstanding it, because the meanings of it constantly change. But I think it's important just to say, listen, these things do change, and that's why it's hard to put our finger on it sometimes.
Well, it's fascinating, and I want to move to the another point you made, because I think our understanding of the alliances and normalization. I mean, it's clearly it's seen as different things by different sides. You also talk about the Gulf and the habit of people of referring to the Gulf as a unified political economic body, in sync with their strategies and so on and so forth. And this is not the case.
Yes. So I think for me, one of the things that one of the good things intellectually about the Abraham Accords was that it elucidated the differences within the GCC. It illustrated the fact that, firstly, people within the GCC, just because they wear a shamagh on the head and they wear a thobe, doesn't mean they all think alike, doesn't mean they all have the same policy, doesn't mean they all have the same ideology, have the same rationality. And I think this is one of for me, the top things about the Abraham Accord really was intellectual, was to show that, listen, the GCC is actually very dynamic here. Saudi Arabia has its position. Qatar made its position. We know by the way, they never deny they have relations with Israel, because they have to have it, and they have what they call working relations with Israel because of Hamas or the Gaza Strip. Kuwait is an outright kind of very antagonistic towards normalization. Oman only recently, by the way, while Netanyahu visited Sultan Qaboos in 2018, but then they only 2 days ago they expanded the boycott of Israel.
Well, and correct me.
And so it's different. It's constantly different. And if I just if I can make this point here, it's so different. Of course, the UAE has its position, and a lot of the times people are talking about little Bahrain. Of course, I think Bahrain is one of the most fascinating aspects here, because Bahrain is playing a very interesting balancing game between Saudi Arabia and the UAE in regards to the Arab. It seems like it's the Arab Peace Initiative and the Abraham Accords, and it's playing this particular balance, and it's just fascinating to see this. Sorry.
No, and your point is well made, and you talk about getting in the nuance and the actual being accurate. If I may be mistaken, but my understanding, the great deliverable, quote unquote, and this is one of the things we've talked about in 966. We didn't feel like the President Biden visit to Saudi Arabia, and also the meeting with heads of state of the GCC and of surrounding nations, both those things happen, was really about deliverables. It was about trying to reestablish a relationship that was workable. That was our opinion. But one of the deliverables that certainly pro-Israeli elements talked about was, Israeli flights were now had overflight capability over Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia said, look, we open it up for everybody. And of course, this is advantageous, not only going, but also any flights to the Far East and that sort of thing. But I gather that there hasn't been much benefit for these Israeli airlines, because Oman has not allowed overflights to these Israeli aircraft. I think they're talking about it now. But to your point is, when you get down into it, there's all sorts of, things that don't appear as they seem, and it's just a fascinating sort of examination.
It is. Sorry, go on. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm really intrigued by your, and we just stumbled upon this, by your description of the Arab Peace, Arab Peace Plan, the O2 Arab Peace Plan, and then Abraham Accords. So if I could really dumb this down, essentially the Arab Peace Plan is about the occupied territories. Essentially, the Abraham Accords, from the Israeli perspective, is about Iran. Is that accurate?
I would say the former was accurate. It's about the territories. The Abraham Accords, I'll say it this way: the Abraham Accords, it's not the Abraham Peace Accords. It's the Abraham Business Accords.
Yes, there you go.
And I think, and I think what's really fascinating about this, and what's also historical about, and to be honest with you, while I have my opinions about things, I never try to just throw away a framework that is used or alleged to solve an issue. Let's give something a try and let's see what happens. But I think what was very interesting about the Abraham Accords was that it was not about a conflict. It was about the materialization of interests.
Mm-hmm.
And business interest and economic interest. And, this is what separates it from the peace deals with Jordan and also peace deals with the peace deal with Egypt in 1979. So, of course, there wasn't a border dispute between them, for example. So this is what was historic about it, and the fact that there wasn't an aspect of transactionality. There wasn't a transaction. There wasn't a land for peace thing, which, of course, what was interesting was this idea that, in my opinion, why now I don't like to just criticize things for the criticism, but now it's just becoming clear that the Abraham Accords is a limited framework. Because it does not address or did not address the core issues that really people cared about. Because what happened was that when it first was framed, it was first framed as, okay, Israel's going to stop annexation. And then in return for annexation, the halting of annexation, we will then normalize relations with you. This was the entry point. This was the kind of the foundation of it. But actually, the annexation was postponed. But it was kind of viewed. And the reason why it's postponed is because if you could just look at the discourse of the current Israeli government now, with elements in it that makes Netanyahu looks like a dove. I mean, if Netanyahu looks like a dove with the people in it, what does that say about the others? So, and they're talking about, annexation again. So what does that say about that original plan? So what is historic about it? And we cannot deny the fact that business ties have grown dramatically, because they're not only they're not only good, robust economies, they're very complementary economies. With Israel, and very technically advanced here. One is a startup, the other one's a scale up. And so they are complementary, and no one is surprised about that. But it's also important to say that the limitations of it. And that's why, for me, the Arab Peace Initiative was a framework that addresses these issues and allows for normalization of relations.
Well, let's talk about public attitudes, because I love that.
Yes.
I love your framing of this as a business, Abraham business accords, because I do feel like, there's significant elements on both sides, but particularly from the South, let's say the Saudi side, this is what they're looking at. I mean, Saudi Arabia is on an enormous bet on its future, trying to diversify and just refashion its whole economy. It wants investment. It sees, obviously, Israel as a technological dynamo in many ways. But Washington Institute, which is a sort of a pro-Israeli, think tank here in Washington, in March 2022, did an interesting survey of the Gulf countries, the Abraham Accord nations. And we'll just look at Saudi Arabia. And the question is, what is your view of Abraham? This is of the average Saudi. What is your view of the Abraham Accords between Israel and UAE, Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan? Now, sort of the political framework, and in Saudi Arabia, only 19%, well, 9% very positive, 10% somewhat positive, so 19%. Right? When the question was reframed, what do people who want to have business and sports contacts with Israelis should be allowed to do so? And strongly agree and somewhat agree in Saudi Arabia, it bumped up to close to 40%. So essentially, again, and I'll simplify for the purpose of the thing, from the Saudi perspective, okay, we're not comfortable with the political proposition. We're certainly comfortable with the person to person and the business and those aspects of growing the relationship. Is that accurate?
Yes, and to be honest, the thing that you said here that I really appreciate was the framing, because also, and I'll talk a little bit after I kind of engage with this one about framing in my kind of experience in trying to engage where people's views are on Israel here within Saudi Arabia. But what this is positive for me, I think, what this, because of course people have their political issues, and people do view this as a political issue, not as a personal anti-Israeli issue. That the problem isn't because you are Israeli. The problem is because of this this particular
of your policies.
issue,
Yeah.
of the policies. Yes. And for me, this is positive, because there, if there's anything more complex than, I think Israel's probably the most complex state in the entire Middle East. I mean, it is. I remember one time being told, and when I gave commentary on, okay, obviously Saudi relations towards Israel, or Arab other relations with Israel, Israel foreign policy, etc. They were like, well, let's talk about the elections. And I was like, oh, absolutely not, because I'm not. This is way too much for me. And they in Israeli civil society is something so rich, that you'd be surprised of how many people agree with so many things. And I personally think there's a lot more that we agree than we disagree on the person to person level. Personally, this is through my experience with Israelis. A lot of them are anti-occupation. A lot of them understand. A lot of them call for the Arab Peace Initiative. Some of them call, I don't want to say a lot, some of them call for the Arab Peace Initiative. And you get this unbelievable nuance of Arab-Israeli relations, which I'm really dedicated to trying to just highlight and just say, listen, everyone around the world, this isn't just Arab versus Jew. This isn't just Muslim versus Israeli. We agree. We have a lot more commonalities than many people think we are. And I think living in the United Kingdom, I saw this problem that we in the Middle East, and particularly Arab-Israeli relations, face, which is that Arab-Israeli relations suffers from a more Catholic than the Pope syndrome. That I think when it comes to people from abroad, and with all due respect, I mean, people from abroad, they when they start talking about this issue, immediately you get the conservative siding here. I'll talk more about, in the UK, conservative side here. Yeah, we're pro-Israeli. Why? Just because, you know what I mean? I gotta be, pro-Israeli. And then when you go on the left wing, more liberal left wing, and then all of a sudden, yeah, free Palestine. Okay, do you know this? You gotta fight for it. You gotta fight for the country. And then you're like, well, okay, but the Palestinians, some of them are not saying no, we have to fight. Some of them are saying no, we need to have this kind of interrelations, and it's nuanced. And what I'm saying to those people is saying, listen, you gotta privilege the voices of those people here and listen to them and say, hey, we actually agree. We don't. The problem is that those other, debates, be it in Oxford or in Cambridge, or when you have for the motion, against the motion, very binary structure, it just constructs a very binary lens, and it's privilege. It's, if it's coming from Oxford, or if it's coming from Cambridge, or if it's coming from Harvard, then it must be very authoritative about this, and this is now the dominant narrative. And that's why I appreciate people like yourselves, quite frankly, is that, you're hosting, you have a nuanced attitude, and that's what's missing about this relation, especially Arab-Israeli, because it's very tempting to view it from a lens of conflict. It's not difficult to use it from a lens of cooperation. And I think that's what I'm trying to do. Still, it's this process.
Right.
And also about framing. I'm sorry to, may I say, or
Absolutely.
go? About the framing, this is what you say is very fascinating, because when I speak with Saudis and I tell them, what do you think about Israel? And it depends on the frame. So when you look at Israel and then you say, well, what about Israel and Iran, or Israel and Hezbollah, or the Houthis? You see them, contemplating, and you're like, I don't see Israel as actually a real problem here. I don't really see it as an issue, not really. I mean, you didn't see much from them, etc. Much negative things. I'm like, okay, fine. Yeah. Well, what about Israel and, for example, Al-Aqsa? And what do you mean by Al-Aqsa? And I say, well, sovereignty over Al-Aqsa. And immediately you get this jolting. You're like, what? On Al-Aqsa? How dare they? Okay. So you're starting to think about the importance of framing when it comes to Israel-Saudi relations. What is it and what frame is it in? And then you get people talking about it. And that's why I really appreciate this point about framing. It's because it's very, very elusive. And that's the point that that's why I like to mention that word when I describe Saudi foreign policy.
Well, and it's
perceptions are
it is. I mean, so much of our dialogue, public discourse, is characterized by the polar extremes, and obviously that's the case in the U.S. And it's the same thing in Israel. I mean, not so much lately, but for a long time, if you ask the surveys of a regular man in the street Israeli, and they talk about relationship with Palestine, and they're very open and optimistic, but the minute you say something like, what about a capital in East Jerusalem? Shut down. Just like Al-Aqsa.
Exactly.
There are red lines, and it's those red lines that continue to struggle. Everyone struggles with now. But I do think it is interesting when we talk about media and that sort of thing. Let's talk, if we can. We talked a lot about the World Cup on the 966 because it's just an amazing event. It was quite a benchmark and a milestone to have it be held in an Arab country, and it was just so much to discuss. It was really rich. One of the interesting things about the world, and anytime you go into an event this large, the largest sporting event in the globe, things are going to happen. One of the things that I think surprised and caught people by surprise is the sort of public gestures and of support for Palestine. What does that reflect in your opinion?
Well, firstly, above all, I think the Qatar World Cup was probably the best World Cup I've seen ever. It was so fantastic. Honestly, it was awesome. It was unbelievable. Quite frankly, it was so entertaining, and a part of me is happy that it's over because I could get back to doing some work.
Now, you admitted you're an FC Barcelona guy.
Yeah.
And Lucian is a Chelsea guy.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, Chelsea guy.
Do we have to end this? Episode 70 is over.
Yeah, probably. Another episode. That's another. Go on.
Were you rooting for Messi because he's a former Barca guy?
No, absolutely. He deserved it. He deserved it. I was so happy for him personally, and I think everyone was like rooting for him. I actually remember just really quick. I remember watching Messi's first game play.
Really?
And Rijkaard. Yeah, I remember. Because he's a year younger than I am. So but he looks a lot younger than I do though. He didn't do the PhD and get stuck on the he's too busy just being awesome. So I remember this, and I remember Rijkaard. So Frank Rijkaard was the coach or head coach or manager, as they say in the United Kingdom. And then they would say, and I remember saying, what's Rijkaard doing playing these little kids? But we want to see the big players. I did not know I was talking about Lionel Messi. I remember that. I always remember that. But I think it goes back to the point of the World Cup. What that does illustrate is, firstly, this notion that, listen, Palestine is still something people care about. It is. I gave a comment to the New York Times about this. They asked for my quote, and I just said the occupation is just too big to sweep under the rug. We could have forward thinking relations with Israel. We could have aspects of the Abraham Accords. It's a different way of thinking. You could move forward. You could develop relations. But that is one thing that it's just very, very difficult to just negate. That is not the 800-pound gorilla in the room. That is the 1,600-pound gorilla in the room.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and it is. I mean, and so that's one thing. The second thing for me, and this is why it's important to constantly be in touch with Israeli colleagues, with Israeli academics, with Israeli analysts, which I am, because we need to understand one another a lot, was that they said many people in Israel were very surprised about that. You know, they literally did not expect that. They expected, because of the discourse of the Abraham Accords, that Arab, you know, everyone's gonna start loving, and hey, and you know, you're welcome, and this and that and the other. And that did not happen. And that's what they, you know, some of my colleagues said, you know, this is why you have to address the issue. There's just simply no dancing around this issue. And I remember telling them, you know, I take no glee in this. I take no glee in seeing a journalist, an Israeli journalist, say, hey, you know, I was like, I don't want to talk with you. You know, some may use it because there's political point scoring. A lot of the times there's political point scoring. And some of these, by the way some of these interviews are done is for political point scoring too. The frames also, to be honest. But I remember saying to a friend, I hope one day an Israeli journalist could visit an Arab country, and they could ask them about how well the Palestinian national football team played. And that's what I strive for, and that's what I think is something that is what infuriates me is how tangible peace can be. But it's just sometimes language and perceptions and social perceptions make it tempting for politicians to take the easy way out, and that's my overarching career goal, I would say, is to try to build these bridges by trying to look at the nuances of relations and focus on the commonalities, not the differences, you know?
Well, one comment on that. And earlier I simplified, and it was really from the Israeli point of view, but I think it's been, when I said, you know, Israel, you know, it's once, you know, the Abraham Accords is about the occupied territories, the Abraham Accords is about Iran. I think, you know, from many in Israel really would like that, you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend doctrine to sort of supersede everything else.
Yeah.
And as you've pointed out, and you make very clear in all your analysis, is that's not the case. You know, the you know, Arab and the Gulf states, you know, partners in the Abraham Accords, that's not their motivation. And it had to be a little bit bracing, again, for the people in those camps to see the groundswell and the societal support for Palestine. But let me ask a question. It might be hard to answer. Is it a matter of time? Is it just a matter of time? And we understand that we have one side sort of trying to frame it, so let's have it happen now. And then the other side say, no, you're looking at one thing, we're actually considering another, and we're prioritizing another. But they are talking.
Yeah.
There are increasing levels of human-to-human interaction, business interplay, investment opportunities. Is it a matter of time?
Let me answer it this way. Speaking of elusivity, but let me answer it this way. The dependency, the Saudi-Israeli relations or Saudi-Israeli normalization will be dependent on two things. It will be dependent on, firstly, what happens on the Palestinian front. There has to be something, something tangible that Saudi Arabia will then build upon its legitimacy and legitimize its relations with Israel based on that aspect. So we're going to have to ask that the time depends on that. Well, that's one aspect of it. The second thing is that, well, what can they get from the United States too? And because if what the Abraham Accords also showed is that it shifted the burden of concessions from Israel to the United States.
Fascinating.
And so it's not just the concessions, it's really what can Saudi Arabia can get also from this. This is my analysis. And so here we're looking at two different things. If there is some, now currently the international relations of Saudi-Israeli relations, I would say, kind of the things that are going around this relationship does not lend itself. The political landscape does not lend itself. The Saudi, I don't see Biden yielding too much to, really put forward a package that will just make it very difficult for Saudi to reject.
Right.
Nor do I see good relations between Biden and Bibi, especially today when the foreign minister, the Israeli foreign minister, spoke with Lavrov, and that kind of received some criticism from the United States. So what they're trying to say is that, okay, listen, what Israel will try to do, where they will be very active to get normalization, is to really generate as much momentum as possible in DC to convince either Congress, the White House, all these elements, like give them an offer that they can't refuse in order for them to normalize here. Now, I see this connection taking place here, and normalization will depend on what happens with these two very contingent elements here that are taking place. If one is very, very much, then we may see. If there is something on the Palestinian front, then it can. It's worth noting the Arab Peace Initiative. Many people don't understand the Arab Peace Initiative, and many people want to criticize the Arab Peace Initiative, especially within Israel, and consider it as something that is not negotiable. And it's actually designed to be negotiable. The language within the Arab Peace Initiative is designed to be negotiable, designed to be flexible. It's designed to do this. But the one of the weaknesses of framing and delivering such a document and constructing such a language is that you could also communicate it, but at the same time, it could be easily denied. You could say, well, we could, no, it's not negotiable. And actually it is, because Saud al-Faisal, for example, said the strength of this Arab Peace Initiative is that it does not go into details. And second, so it's based on principles. And secondly, also, he said, listen, it's up to the Arabs. They could deny, they could change it, they could mold it, they could adapt it. It's up to them. And in 2016, there was talk in the Arab League to actually construct it and make it more flexible as a basis of negotiation. The Netanyahu interview with Al Arabian 2 weeks ago, was that 2 weeks ago or a week ago? He was asked, he's like, listen, use the Arab Peace Initiative as a basis of negotiation. So when you're looking at, of course, Al Arabiya, Saudi, so here is a sign that could be easily denied, and says, listen, work within this framework. Work within this framework, and then we could see what happens. So it's a very fluid issue. And there's just another thing that I wanted to also say. For example, say in the future, maybe I will say the forces seem to be going that way anyway. The globalization forces, the forces of economic diversification, etc., seems to be going that way, pushing that way. But is a lack of a Palestinian state something good? Or is Saudi Arabia normalizing relations outside the framework of the Arab Peace Initiative? Or not without something tangible in the Palestinian issue good? Is it okay? It is not okay. And I tell you who doesn't say it's okay. So many Israelis think it's not okay. And the reason being is because what they see Saudi Arabia as a leverage on a Israeli government to apply pressure to get something on the ground for Palestinians, because what's going to happen is that, as you both know, it's going towards an apartheid regime. And what will happen is that, listen, you're going to have either an Israel that is not governed by Jews, if everyone has the same rights,
Mhm.
or an Israel that is not democratic whatsoever, and both are against the fundamentals of Zionism. So many people think Zionism is just Zionism is complex. There's strands of Zionism, some strand, but those are the principles of Zionism. So what I think is fruitful to discuss is really the costs of a Saudi-Israeli normalization outside a Palestinian state, or a solution outside the Palestinian state. And that is something that I don't think many people are talking about. That's why I thank you guys for making me think about this. And that's the next thing that I will write about.
Well, it's just really so enriching, Dr. Aziz. This is great. You make a really interesting point when you talk about the burden of concession has now moved from Israel to the U.S. And you see that in the Abraham Accords. I mean, essentially, the U.S. bought off Morocco and Sudan. I mean, in order to, Sudan is not, in order to, the Trump administration recognized Moroccan control over the disputed Western Sahara as an incentive for Morocco to come onto this. Again, with Sudan, which you pointed out, is not ratified it, but the U.S. removed Sudan from the State Department list of state sponsors, and gave it a $1.2 billion loan to help clear its World Bank debt. So these were U.S. concessions; these weren't Israeli concessions. Also, before we have to get a plug in here for your scholarship, you also wrote another excellent article for the Arab Gulf States Institute in November called "The Depth of the Palestinian Ingredient in Saudi Political Identity and Projection." Again, I recommend that. This has been fascinating, but there's one last element, Aziz, if we can get there, and you mentioned that you'd like to talk about that, something we talk about on the 966, and I mentioned we did a one big thing on the changing Saudi perception of itself in the world order. And I spoke about, and Lucia and I discussed, how 2022 was such a consequential year in that, and two basic things. The Russian invasion of Ukraine forced really a global reassessment of where people stand. Saudi Arabia is going to end this year as $1 trillion economy. First time it ticked over. And it puts it very much in that middle power, segment of countries. It sees itself differently now. How does that impact all of this?
All of the with the Saudi...
how does it, in terms of its relationship with Israel, the region, its responsibilities with regard to the Abraham Accords, that which they, of course, they're not part of, but does it change how it wants to navigate the world going forward?
Well, personally, I see this, of course, as you guys rightfully mentioned this, that it sees itself different, and I think within this process of changing of world order and the multipolarity of it, and I just wanted to mention about this multipolarity, by the way. I think to say it's a pure multipolar system now, I don't see Saudi Arabia viewing it as a pure multipolar system. I think Saudi views the international world order as an asymmetric multipolar system. And what I mean by that is that it still sees the United States as its preferred security guarantor, its main partner, its main security partner, not Allah, but main security partner. But it won't think twice going elsewhere. And I think that's the difference, between what's going on. And when it comes to this idea of, that's what I was talking about with becoming a force now, that, it's the ambition. I'm telling you, I've lived in the UK for 13 years. I left from 2005, came back, and I could sense the ambition all throughout Saudi Arabia, in all places. I mean, in every circles, and that there isn't just a political identity, a foreign policy projection, but there's even something within Saudis now in Saudi society that I see myself. But how I see this taking place, and I think with the Abraham Accords and and the Arab Peace Initiative, for example, or the Saudi position. What Saudi will not join the Abraham Accords, and it will not be in its benefit to join the Abraham Accords, because it will then be seeming like following a trend set by the UAE, which is what I meant by the legacy.
Mm-hmm.
This is the legacy here. So now, as Saudi Arabia is growing, and as Saudi Arabia is attracting more and more investments, more attraction, and it's becoming a global player, not just in oil.
Mm-hmm.
It's becoming a tourist hub. It's becoming a place where people want to invest. And we still have some time to go, but it's going there urgently. Therefore, I think when it comes to Arab-Israeli relations, it will have a framework that speaks to its legacy, not following a legacy of the Abraham Accords, because that's already been dictated and kind of trailblazed by someone else who in itself, by the way, everyone's taken notes of this is an experiment and what's going on here.
Right.
There was limitations, there are benefits to this, but there are limitations too. So this is all part of the calculation of how a potential deal in the future will be. Now, personally, I argue the Arab Peace Initiative in itself is broad enough to accept something in the future, whether that's a transactional nature of relations. Okay, if you stop this, then we could do this, and then if you stop that, then we could do that. Maybe that's one aspect of it. But when you have something that's built on principles, it opens up a lot of options. And I anticipate, and there's another thing, by the way, I won't be surprised if normalization takes a while, because why buy the cow when you could get the milk? There's a lot of things. What I argue in my work is that I reconceptualize cooperation, and I say cooperation is not just tacit or official, secret or open. There's also passive and active forms. And what I mean by this is that actually Saudi-Israeli cooperation at times, especially, for example, with Iran or the economy, etc., is a harmonious form of relations. And sometimes they cooperate by getting out of each other's way, rather than actually working towards each other. This is what I meant by actually the concept. Saudi-Israeli relations is actually pushing the boundaries, the conceptual boundaries of things that we always say of concepts. So when someone comes in with a framework or a concept of alliances, it doesn't explain this. But when someone says, okay, well, passive cooperation, and what is meant by passive cooperation, and it's actually a way of just saying, you know what, let's cooperate by just getting out of each other's way. This is a very interesting form that's deniable, legitimate, and you don't need to normalize relations to get sometimes your goals together, because the overarching regional goals spills over into the other regionals' goals. So there's a very delicate balancing here that takes place. And Saudi, I've always been very fascinated with Saudi foreign policy and Saudi language. It comes, I don't know if you guys have time or not, but it comes actually from my grandmother, who used to tell me stories about my grandfather who used to work with King Faisal, and he was
diplomat.
Yeah. I mean, he was in his royal court, and how they were very, how they would communicate very implicitly with each other. That's what really inspired me. I would hear her stories telling me it again and again. And that's what really inspired me to I was like, I really want to expand upon this, and the Saudi ruling elite, historically, even in the days of Ibn Saud, what made them survive was pragmatism. It was bravery. It was wisdom, but it was pragmatism. They knew how to understand. They knew how to use language. very well. They knew how to gain ambiguity on their side, and they knew how to postpone and delay. Language was such a fascinating instrument of survivability. And we always talk about diplomacy, and it's like the fork is on here and the knife is on here, and all this kind of, diplomacy is as a survival mechanism. It's so fascinating that we see. And another thing, and then I'll shut up because I'm talking too much here. But another thing is that, many people talk about, these Bedouins, these nomads, these camel milk drinking people and date eating. What do they know about sophistication of politics? What they do in their language requires a multidisciplinary approach to actually explain this aspect of communicating something yet withdrawing it at the same time. So I had to go to psychoanalysis and understand the language of and Lacan and kind of these other concepts. It's a complex, very fascinating, sophisticated process that Saudi ruling elite have been practicing, and exercising throughout their history. This is why I think it's very worth looking into.
Richard, I think enriching is the word you used a few minutes ago. That would be a perfect way to describe this conversation with Dr. Aziz. Yeah. Dr. Aziz Alghashian, Saudi researcher and writer who joins us from a still rainy Riyadh. Keep an eye out for Dr. Aziz. He's often quoted in media outlets like the NYT, France 24, Sky, BBC. The list could go on. Dr. Aziz, thank you so much for joining us. The cowboy thing kind of clashes with the blue and silver. I think burgundy and gold would fit in with the motif there, but thank you so much for the time and this awesome discussion today.
My pleasure. Thank you all. You guys are fantastic. You guys are, I hope we have more people like you that have the same philosophy, and I'm just so honored to be joining you guys. So thank you very much.
The honor was ours, and the education was ours. This was really informative, Dr. Aziz. Thank you so much.
That was our really awesome conversation with Dr. Aziz Alghashian. A reminder, please subscribe to our YouTube channel, especially. You get a lot of these different segments like we're about to do on Yallah, and these interviews are all there isolated. So if you just want to get back and listen to some interviews from previous episodes or this interview, you can do that on YouTube. And we get a lot of views on that, a lot of comments on that. Again, also another reminder, please keep the comments civil to each other. You can say whatever you want about us. We have very thick skin, but do not engage with other users in a mean-spirited way. We do not have time to go in and clean it up. So please don't do that. And also any crypto recommendations that people are putting in there, we don't really need any, but it's a free forum, so you can say whatever you want. But yeah. And they're not very good. I know. I lost them. No, they're not very.
Following them. Yeah.
well, our 966 coin has yet to be launched, but that is going to be a real Web3 game changer.
I wonder what we're going to name that, but it's I don't know.
Yeah. Well, we got a little work to do to get it together anyway, so we got some time to come up with a good name,
Yes, exactly. Yes. Dr. Aziz was just a great conversation. I think this is going to bounce. I think they were going to find this really interesting. We're having every episode seems to grow in terms of people who are looking at it and seeing it. So our numbers keep going up. I think people are going to like this one.
Yep, absolutely. I was enraptured for that whole thing. So, yeah, really good. Richard, what do you think? Let's get to Yallah.
Saudi in a minute.
Yallah. See, if the listeners and viewers out there knew how fun it was to hear yourself do that in a microphone, they would also do it.
They would all go get a microphone and say
Yallah.
Number one. Well, this is exciting. This has been all the rage, hasn't it?
Oh, yes. Let's do it.
Portugal's Cristiano Ronaldo, I don't know if you've heard of him, joined Saudi Arabia club Al Nassr. Portugal captain Cristiano Ronaldo has joined Saudi Arabian club Al Nassr on a 2.5-year deal. A month after the 37-year-old forward became a free agent when his contract with Premier League club Manchester United was terminated. My colleague, Lucian Ziegler, really hoped he would go to Chelsea, but they were outbid by Al Nasser. Al Nasser said the 5-time Ballon d'Or winner will join on a deal until 2025, but did not disclose any financial details. Ronaldo's contract with the team has been estimated by media to be worth more than $214.5 million.
Okay, how do we keep this segment really short? Because this is supposed to be Yallah, but this is sort of worth a longer discussion. A few points to make. No, I've never heard of Cristiano Ronaldo. I've heard of Georgina Rodriguez.
And
I assume that that is,
pull.
I assume that he is her boyfriend, but I'm not really sure. I'm solely focused on her.
He's known as Mr. Rodriguez, is that correct?
I think so, yeah. And the reason why I make that point, aside to be crass, is that I think that this is sort of what we're seeing here is so much bigger than soccer, than football. They're going to be sort of like the Kardashians of Saudi Arabia for the next couple of years. Every move they make will be followed by local press. And Richard, you saw that Arabian Business is hiring a Ronaldo reporter to be basically based in Riyadh full time.
Something like 1,000 people have already applied.
That's amazing. And I'm sure that job would be awesome. And they've already given, so there's so much to talk about here. There's already so much news. Ronaldo did a huge ceremony this week in Riyadh on Monday. Took a PJ, uploaded a video confirming his deal. A few hours later, he was out there, kicking soccer balls around and taking photos with kids. It's really cool. This is big for Saudi soccer too, because it sort of adds a lot of legitimacy to Al Nasser, and really will help them with getting the World Cup in 2030. If and I believe that's either part of his deal or not part of his deal, but he will be an unofficial spokesman. So I'm passing it over to you because that's there's so much more.
Well, I agree. And also, I guess he and Miss Georgina have 2 kids. Is that right?
Yes.
Or expecting 2 kids, have 2 kids. They aren't married, so obviously they'll be living. So that's the sort of thing, the scrutiny will be relentless. We've just discovered that he can't make his debut with Al Nasser because he still has to serve out a penalty when he I guess, slapped a smartphone out of a fan's hand. So when he was at Manchester United, so he got penalized by FIFA. It's a 2-game penalty, which he hasn't served. So I gather his debut will be delayed. But that's a minor thing. The reports on his contract, I've seen several reports. One of them I've seen that the deal is broken into a football aspect, which is 75 million, and a commercial and image aspect, which is 134 million. Speaking to your point about being a representative and spokesperson for not only Saudi soccer, but regional soccer, Asian soccer. And, Lionel Messi is already a spokesman for the country in terms of tourism. It's really an interesting move. I mean, clearly he's 37. He's at the end of his career. But obviously the star power is almost unparalleled. It's sort of him and Messi, if you're talking about global recognition. And it's an interesting move. I mean, there are parallels with when David Beckham came to LA. So that was in 2007. But David Beckham was 31. It was a 5-year deal. And but it'd be for Saudi's perspective, it'd be nice if the parallel played out because it really bumped up U.S. soccer. It added the prestige, added to the gate. Franchises grew. It was a good deal for everybody. That Beckham 5-year deal. So this is really a fascinating take, and it's going to be fun to watch, and it'll draw a lot of eyes and a lot of attention, and it'll definitely elevate the awareness of the Saudi football scene, which is considerable already.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it will elevate the Asian football club, Asian football league, in its entirety.
Yeah. The media is going to benefit tremendously. Saudi Research and Marketing Group, some of these other big media outlets in the region will feast on this because everyone wants to know, not just in Saudi Arabia, what's going on with Ronaldo, but globally. I mean, he's the second biggest superstar now. He's among the top of all time. He's an absolute legend. Like you mentioned, 5-time Ballon d'Or. So, I mean, and the way this is being sort of couched is this is like, he's accomplished everything he needs to accomplish in European football. And now it's time for Asia. It's cool. It's fascinating. It was expensive for Saudi Arabia. It is expensive for Saudi Arabia. But this will sort of create so much in this. It's an investment really, and will create so much. So many dollars, reals will follow into this. A lot of interest, and I've read somewhere that he can be on loan. Is that correct? To some of these clubs in Europe, if need be. So he may be back. Newcastle. That's right.
Newcastle.
That's right.
Apparently that wasn't part of his contract, but yeah, that's been rumored. And, if you look at, so last year, 2021, 22 matches, 125 million spectators attended matches in Saudi Arabia. 250 million watched it on TV. It's already a big ecosystem. It's already a really avid and strong fan base. People are going to start streaming Al Nassr games and Saudi League games and that sort of thing. And, that 250 million watching, will now move beyond the region and out, and it grows from there. So you don't even know what the long-term returns on this. And obviously that's what they're betting on. But it's going to be fascinating to watch, and things like this. So you said in jest, Georgina Rodriguez, but these little side stories. I hope they don't blow up, and I hope they become like the Kardashians.
Yeah,
you were talking about the Kardashians and the level of interest, but hopefully they can keep it together, not make mistakes, and do good.
Yep, Richard, this is devastating news for our club, Al Faya FC, out of Al Majma. So we will hopefully be pursuing our own big name international superstars to be brought into Al Majma to compete and to go head to head with Ronaldo.
I think Al Nassr and Al Fayed are not in the same league. I'm certain they aren't, but you are exactly right. That opportunity is now off the table.
Yep. Good stuff. Richard, we get some criticism when we talk about sports here because we talk about everything.
We're jocks for one thing.
Yes, but we have not mentioned, and I'm going to do it now to get us started in 2023. We have not mentioned golf yet. It is not going to be coming up in our Yallah, but boom, episode 70, the word golf. There it is.
There it is.
Sorry, Abdulrahman. There it is. Yallah number 2. Hyundai Motor to be the first Korean car maker with a factory in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia's Ministry of Industry and Mineral Resources, which we've talked about earlier in this episode, has signed an MOU with the South Korean company Hyundai Motors to build a factory for the complete assembly of electric cars in the kingdom. The MOU stipulates planning to build a complete assembly plant with the, quote, CKD system for electric cars and internal combustion engine cars to be located in Saudi Arabia.
Again, we referenced it in the one big thing, I think yours, about this sector and manufacturing sector, and they've been enamored and fascinated by it for years because of technology, because there's a market for it, and because it creates jobs and generates and brings skilled workers. So Saudi Arabia's goal is to manufacture over 3,000 cars by the year 2030. This last year and a half has been amazing, with the Lucid Motors commitment to come to King Abdullah Economic City, the Foxconn commitment to come and make EVs at King Abdullah Economic City with a Sear. Now this Hyundai Motor one is interesting because it's both EVs and internal combustion engines. And it's also interesting. I didn't know what CKD meant.
It's like knockdown technology, right?
Completely knocked down.
Yeah.
That's what it's, and it's an acronym for kits of the loose parts necessary to assemble a complete vehicle in a customer's own plant. So, and I guess there's advantages, customs advantages, and other things.
Yep.
But this is the first. Hyundai this would be the first Korean automaker to build a car manufacturing factory in the Middle East. I guess Hyundai has a manufacturing corporation in Turkey, but in the Middle East, proper Middle East, this is the first one. This commitment to do it would be the first one.
Yeah. Yeah. Very interesting. That's for 2022. That's a lot of movement in the space, as you mentioned, with Lucid, with Sear, now with this. I mean, this is a good story for the ministry. It's a good story for Saudis. And I think there's going to be more coming on this. But the knockdown thing is very interesting. I mean, when you're talking about setting up a manufacturing facility or any sort of industrial complex, I mean, if you're going to save billions of dollars with a CKD system, manufacturing parts where they're already being manufactured and then importing them to be assembled, it makes sense for many reasons, but efficiency being the top reason, because you just don't need to recreate the wheel in Saudi Arabia, but it's still manufacturing and there's still a lot of high tech jobs that will go into that. And so there will be a lot of knowledge transfer between South Korea and Saudi Arabia. And there was just a big delegation from the Ministry of Investment, I believe, as well as some venture capitalist organizations in Saudi Arabia going to South Korea. So there's an uptick in sort of the South Korea-Saudi Arabia relationship going on. Yeah.
And I guess the Lucid plant is going to be assembly only at first, with the intent to eventually become a full manufacturing. But that Lucid initially will be. I did not hear the term CKD with the Lucid, so there may be some variations on that.
So what would be the play there? Do you think they would manufacture in Arizona and then ship them over and start assembling there and then start, Yeah. Interesting.
I guess. Yeah.
Yeah.
And again, that's initially the intent is to move on to full manufacturing on site in Saudi.
Yeah. Very cool. Very cool. I mean, that's a lot of movement in the EV space. So we expect to sort of see a lot of stuff this year on charging stations and, batteries in the kingdom. So hot spot.
Employment, number 3, Yallah, number 3. Employment in Saudi Arabia's non-oil sector rises at strongest pace since 2018. Hiring at companies in Saudi Arabia's non-oil sector at strongest pace in about 5 years this December, driven by robust business activity. The acceleration in sales growth drove businesses in the kingdom to increase hiring in December to boost operating efficiency. The rate of job creation was the fastest recorded since January 2018. While the increase in staffing capacity helped companies to reduce outstanding work for the 7th month running.
Yeah, Richard, we did a feature on this week for sustg.com and goes out in our newsletter. This is all stuff that you've seen as well, but there's really a lot of movement for unemployment, especially for Saudis. Saudi male citizens' unemployment fell to the lowest level since 1999. More than 20 years. Labor force participation rate for Saudi women continued to rise, reaching 37%. That's not where they want it yet, but the trend is obviously in the right direction. Jobs is really the sort of fruit of Vision 2030. Really good, high-paying, quality jobs for Saudi is the result of good policy decisions and realizing the VRPs and the NTP, all these things go and you'll be able to see it in jobs. So there was really good news coming out from the Ministry of Economy and Planning. And actually we'll include a link to this as well. I've got a lot of things to put into the show notes, but they sort of came out with some just bullet points in English on sort of where the job market stands. A lot of traction and progress for the MEP.
That was really good. They call it an analytical bulletin. This is what you're referring to. It's the Ministry of Economy and Planning. But what is interesting too, because it does have a lot of factoids. I hope it can come through clearly and people can see it. It's talking about the third quarter of 2022, which in theory doesn't include that December. So there may be even this report, which you say is a really good one and out in English with some interesting data points, may not even be as glowing as it actually is, if it continued to improve, over into the fourth quarter.
Yep. Very good progress for them, the labor front. Also, the PMI remained pretty much at 56-ish, which is above 50, representing growth. So, and a lot of it, a lot of it's oil, but the non-oil economy, seeing that sort of start to build. We're at 2023 now, so it's good to see. Richard, Yallah number 4, Saudi Arabia gains a majority stake in Magic Leap with a $450 million deal. The kingdom has taken a majority share of the U.S.-based augmented reality company Magic Leap, according to a report in The Telegraph, widening the stake via its state-owned sovereign wealth fund, the PIF, with a deal amounting to $450 million. The investment puts the country's ownership of Magic Leap over 50%, giving it overall majority control. To date, Magic Leap has raised $4 billion, with minority investors including Google, Alibaba, Qualcomm, AT&T, and the German-based VC fund Axel Springer.
I don't have much to add there. I think we included this just because it was interesting and notable in the sense of, the nature and breadth of their investment interests. Magic Leap has struggled. It came out sort of out of that like gangbusters, but hasn't really been able to monetize. I think it's less consumer focused now and more in the professional services, but nonetheless, it's doing some, has some interesting and promising technology. I just think it's an interesting bet.
It's an interesting bet, and now they have majority control over it. So that's very significant. So we'll see what happens with that. They have the same they sort of did the same thing in a different way with Lucid, right? They sort of worked their way up and then went over the 50% mark. And now they control the board of that company, which is interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. There was a great Wall Street Journal report on the sausage making at the PIF. We saw, I think, on
that was good
from the summer sage, was one of the best.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Sausage making is a good term. And I guess they're trying to really to build that out with, talk about the early days. It was, obviously there was staffing shortages and expertise that wasn't there, and they're trying to build all that out. Yallah number 5.
5.
Gulf Cup gives Iraq chance to draw closer to Arab neighbors. From January 6 to 19, the southern city of Basra will host the 25th edition of the Arabian Gulf Cup, a biennial football tournament among Gulf Arab states first held in 1970 in Bahrain. Iraq will be the venue of a major international football competition for the first time since it both hosted and won the AGC, Arabian Gulf Cup, in 1979. 8 regional teams, Bahrain, Iraq, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the United Arab Emirates, and Yemen, will participate in the tournament. Matches will take place at the Basra International Stadium and Al Mina Olympic Stadium venues with capacities of 65,000 and 30,000 spectators, respectively.
Yeah, interesting. Progress for Iraq after the last 25 years have been pretty rough. So I don't have much to add, but this is an interesting story.
I thought it was really interesting because first, I didn't know there was an Arabian Gulf Cup, much less one they've been having 25 years. Secondly, I guess Iraq had been excluded from the tournament, which I guess lopsides the matches and that sort of thing, from 1990 to 2004 because of its invasion of Kuwait. And so hosting edition is kind of a significant milestone in terms of its re-entry into the region. And I think in general, certainly Saudi Arabia is trying to up its trade and interaction with Iraq and get in a more stable political standing. And also it's in Basra too, which is in the south. So it should be fairly easily accessible. Basra has sort of been the south is predominantly Shiite. And part of the putting this on has been a lot of investment in the Basra and upgrading infrastructure, malls, parks, entertainment venues. Anyway, I thought it was interesting. Again, I didn't know there was an Arabian Gulf Cup, and apparently this has been going on since 1970, obviously. But so this is the 25th, so it's exciting. It'll be back in Iraq.
Well, Richard, I will not be watching because I'm still upset about the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and my boycott continues to live on. But this is cool. I did not know there was an Arabian Gulf Cup either. So this is an educational program for us too as hosts, which is great. Yallah number 6, our final Yallah this week. Saudi Arabia to launch Kingdom's version of Airbnb. Saudi Arabia is to allow citizens to operate Airbnb-style property rentals after the kingdom announced a new portal similar to the global lettings marketplace. The Minister of Tourism, Ahmed Al-Khatib, approved the tourism law this week. Properties will be advertised through an official tourism service provider in line with the regulations set by the ministry, which will publish prices inclusive of taxes. Strict guidelines have been issued on maintaining tourists' privacy, with constant surveillance of authorities on security, health, and safety measures, including ambulance and evacuation procedures. Huh.
I thought this one, you might like this one. I mean, being a former Airbnb proprietor,
Yes. Yes.
and all sort of frequent users of them here, this is really an interesting build out in their tourism sector.
Mm-hmm.
And it'd be fascinating how it develops. The article is a good one. It talks about people's experience going and staying with Saudi families, and how much they enjoyed it, and it was much more authentic experience. But I think this is nascent. But boy, if that builds out, again, that really involves the private sector, and you can maybe have a gig economy that's not driving a car or whatever, but maybe if you have property, and a lot of people in Saudi Arabia have property, this is another way to monetize it.
Yeah, I'm just sort of thinking about it. I mean, as you know, I had an Airbnb English basement in my house in DC, which was awesome. We loved doing it. 4.9 star ranking, so we did an okay job. And it was sort of cool. It was a separate space. We got to meet people occasionally through it, which was always interesting. I had a huge map of Arabia, which is actually this downstairs in the Airbnb, and people were like, what is with the map of Saudi Arabia in here? I was like, well, you don't have any other wall art. So this is cool, Richard. I'm just sort of thinking about it right now. But I mean, you have a lot of new hotels in Riyadh, and they're really nice. And a lot of the American brands that are in Riyadh, like I've stayed recently the last few months at Courtyards and Hilton Garden Inns. They seem to be a lot nicer in Riyadh than they are here in the US, but there's a lot of good hotel offerings in Riyadh, especially. I mean, and Al Khobar, I was there a few weeks ago, stayed in a Le Méridien. So, I mean, this is interesting though, because there are a lot of properties in Riyadh that are either investment properties or, homes that are being unused. And I think it would be awesome to be able to stay there for roughly the same cost and get a lot more. I'm sure there are going to be some really cool residences in Riyadh that are available to rent.
Well, it'll be fun to watch this sector grow, and I'm sure there'll be growing pains and amazing stories and horror stories. That's the nature of the business. But I just think it's cool they're going into it, or they're regulating for it now.
So is Riyadh can you not get anything on Airbnb in Riyadh right now?
It hasn't been a thing. I think increasingly so, it appears, but I just don't think that's ever been a thing where you had a network and a someplace where you could go and find private residences for rent.
It looks like, so they're saying here, right? I'm looking at Airbnb right now. There's 1,000 homes in Riyadh that are available. That's got to be, because it's never occurred to me to do it there. There's sort of an internet backlash against Airbnb that's kind of ongoing right now, but a lot of people are upset about rentals not including fees. And I noticed that the press release we read, it makes it very transparent what the fees are. But there's sort of like an anti Airbnb host requiring guests to throw out trash and make the beds and stuff. And there's some horror stories of guests being required to do a lot more than that. This will be interesting. So it sounds like there'll be a separate company outside of Airbnb that may try to take this over to sort of localize this. Yeah, I'm looking here. There looks like some pretty cool apartments in Riyadh. So that just means that there are a lot more out there that are unrealized. So Richard, maybe when we return next, we'll stay in a massive palace or some sort of complex
for the same cost as a Marriott
for Hilton Garden Inn. Yeah. Yeah, this is interesting. They have Countryside. Cool. Let's see if that offers anything.
I think that's that in other areas like in Jizan down southwest. I think which they're bringing in a lot of new properties, but it's not fully developed by any sense. That might be really neat. Yeah,
this is cool. We'll have to check this out. Let's keep our eye on this. If that government portal opens up, let's revisit this topic. I think
it will get back on. We will. It'll be fun to watch. I think we will revisit it at some point.
Yeah, cool. Richard, great episode. Thank you. Thank you so much. Number 70. We'll be back next week with 71. We're kicking off the new year with a really good run of shows here. So stay tuned. And Richard, thank you.
Thank you. It's awesome to be going in 2023.
Yes. Take care.